Face it, shaker bottles suck. Your protein shake always comes out clumpy and you look like an idiot using the thing. That's why I decided to ditch my shaker bottle for good and get myself a BlendJet 2 portable blender. It makes perfectly blended protein shakes that come out smooth, creamy, and delicious in just 20 seconds. So go to BlendJet.com and use promo code DCASTPOD at checkout to get 12% off your order. That's promo code DCASTPOD to get 12% off your order at checkout.
Have you ever wanted to learn a new language, but just didn't have the time or money? I may have a solution for you. Her name is Jessica, and she gives free Chinese lessons daily at 11 p.m. Beijing time and 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Chinese is fun and easy if you have the right teacher. Let Jessica be that teacher and introduce yourself to the fastest growing language in the international job market today at tinyurl.com/tcjessica and tell her Ian sent you. Hello and welcome to the Deathcast. I'm your host, author, and journalist Ian Tott, and I'd like to thank you for joining me as we prepare to take our fourth look at the West Memphis 3. Now, before we get going, as always, I have the normal show notes. If you would like to help support this show, there's a couple of ways you can do that. First and foremost, go to your favorite podcast app and leave a 5-star review. Don't forget to subscribe while you're there. Next, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/the+Deathcast. And lastly, you can go to tinyurl.com/DCAST Patreon and become a Patreon member for as little as $2 a month. You can find exclusive content, ad-free shows, along with exclusive content pertinent to each of the cases that we cover. I'd like to give a shout out to our lone Patreon member, Channel. I appreciate the heck out of you, bud. You've done a lot to support this show, and I can't thank you enough, so thank you for becoming a Patreon member. Alright, now that all of that's out of the way, get yourself something to drink, find a nice comfy chair. I've got my coffee. Let's go into the crypt. We left off last week. We were discussing the events of May 5th, 1993, particularly the movements of the parents who were in the neighborhood at the time that the 3 8-year-old boys, Michael Moore, Stevie Brand, and Christopher Byers went missing. We also discussed a rather condensed version of the story that Jesse Miss Kelly would ultimately tell in his last 2 confessions. Today we're going to move on to the events of May 6th, 1993. That's the day that the bodies of these 3 innocent victims were discovered in Robin Hood Hills. I do need to give a content warning before we get into anything. The injuries that were perpetrated against these 3 8-year-old boys were extremely gruesome. They were also burned into the minds of a generation of Americans, thanks to the Paradise Lost film, which opened up with the removal of the bodies from the muddy swamp water in full explicit detail. These weren't 3 boys who were grabbed and shot in the head. These boys were beaten badly, tortured. 2 of them were placed into the water alive and left to drown. And unfortunately, despite what the supporters say, these 3 young boys are really forgotten in this case due to the hoopla surrounding the celebrity that is Damien Eccles and his 2 partners in crime. Everybody wants to make a big deal about, oh, these 3 innocent boys were wrongfully convicted. The evidence doesn't show that. The evidence, if anything, shows that the 3 men who were accused and convicted of the crime were guilty. And it continues to show that, because nothing that the West Memphis 3 or their supporters have ever claimed has ever come to pass, including DNA testing that was supposed to take place in the mid-2000s, as the defense claimed that it would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that their clients were in fact not guilty. However, the court gave them this ability to do this testing. As far as we know, it was carried out, yet the West Memphis 3, their supporters, and their defense team have never released the results of that testing. Not even going to get into Eccles' whole charade of trying to keep his name in print more than 10 years after being released from prison by claiming that he has a right to test the DNA. No, you lost that right when your parole expired, and you knew that going in. You just dragged your feet doing all the crap you wanted to get into, and then realized, oh, my name's not getting as much print anymore. Better make a stink. Which, of course, now a court has ruled they have a right to, despite the fact that, as far as the state of Arkansas is concerned, they're guilty. All boils down to money and pressure. West Memphis 3 and their supporters have money. They have pressure from celebrities in Hollywood. They're going to get their way.
Such is the world. So now the next morning, the search for the boys continued, and they began to widen their search area in an effort to try and locate Michael, Stevie, and Christopher. Around 8 a.m., the West Memphis Police Department held a briefing before dispatching detectives to the area to continue the search. In addition to members of the West Memphis Police Department, we also had the search and rescue team from the Crittenden County Sheriff's Department, along with numerous volunteers. This was really an all-hands-on-deck situation. I want to describe the area where the bodies was found, known as Robin Hood Hills. It's actually an irrigation canal that is part of the 10-mile bayou, which is an area oftentimes filled with water, very lush greenery. And from interviews with Sid Udy, Psycho Sid in the WWF that I conducted about 6 years ago, it's an area where, at least according to him, kids would go to hang out and party. It's really not a pleasant place to hang out in, as again, it is a bayou. There's mosquitoes, there's all other kinds of animals, and yes, there are snapping turtles. We're going to get to that here shortly. But it's a very large area, drains out eventually into the Mississippi River. Somewhere around 1:45 p.m., searchers who were down inside of Robin Hood Hills noticed a tennis shoe floating in the water. A man by the name of Mike Allen, who was part of the search and rescue efforts, walked along the muddy bank in an effort to try and get this tennis shoe. Describing the area, Allen would later say that while the rest of the embankment was strewn with leaves and other debris, the area that he was in was really devoid of any leaves or anything, and he believed that the area had possibly been washed clean, or, as he put it, the area looked slick, although there were scuff marks in the mud as though it had been intentionally done. Mike Allen ends up falling into the water in his effort to try and recover this shoe, and it's while he's in the water that he feels something bumping and brushing up against him. Eventually, this thing would surface, and much to the disgust and horror of those present, it would later be found to be the body of Michael Moore. Another patrolman who was in the area later stated that he saw what he believed to have been blood in the water prior to the discovery of the bodies, although it did not appear that there was any blood elsewhere. So after the discovery of this body of Michael Moore, Another detective by the name of Brian Ridge volunteers to get into the water and methodically search the area. In his own words, Ridge states, "I got into the water north of the bodies, north of the victim that had been located, who was, we discovered, was Michael Moore, and I proceeded to work my way through the water, through the ditch, and being careful not to destroy any evidence. I was searching the bottom of the ditch as I made my way to the body. I found some clothing items, which were found to have been jammed into the mud floor using sticks. Obviously, there's a flurry of activity at this point, and there are some people who kvetch about the fact that the bodies were removed from the water. Reality is, any evidence that may have been on site at that point was long gone due to the fact that the boys had been submerged in the water for an indeterminate period of time. I have read anywhere from 15 to 19 hours. There really wasn't going to be any evidence that would be usable in court then or now because of cross-contamination with the muddy water. So about 2:45, Michael's body is removed from the ditch and placed on the side of the muddy embankment. Not long after this, at about 2:56, the body of Stevie Branch is discovered, and at 2:59, the body of Christopher Byers is discovered. They were about 25 feet away from where Michael's body had been discovered. Now, the bodies were placed on the bank in black plastic as searchers continued to comb the area. At 3:20 p.m., Coroner Kent Hale is summoned to the scene and arrives at 3:55. After identifying the bodies, he pronounces them dead. Chris and Stevie's bodies were discovered face down in the mud, while Michael came up to the surface of his own accord on his left side. And it's believed that he may have been placed lying in the mud on his right side and turned over as he came up. Officer Ridge went about collecting all the various pieces of evidence, specifically the articles of clothing that were found in the water. And this entire scene really was captured in Paradise Lost. If you've never seen it, you will never forget it. I do have to give the two SOBs that made that film some credit in regards to this. The film was extremely impactful, showing just what this does not only to the families, but really to the community of West Memphis as a whole. Outside of that, the film is absolute rubbish, with the exception of the court hearing scenes, which would eventually have to be turned over as evidence as they recorded pretty much the entire trial. The bodies of Michael, Stevie, and Christopher were found to have been bound with shoelaces, as previously discussed in last week's episode. Right hand to right ankle, left hand to left ankle. We will get into the various wounds that were found on the boys' bodies shortly. The boys were sent to the state medical lab, where they were to be autopsied by Dr. Frank Peretti. Unfortunately, members of the family were present when the boys' bodies were removed from the crime scene, and you can see Terry Hobbs's wife just absolutely break down and lose her mind. Obviously, it's not something any parent wants to experience, and it's something that, unfortunately was caught on film for the world to see.
Police end up dredging Robin Hood Hills in an effort to look for evidence. Fortunately, there really was none. And then they really began searching the area, trying to find anything that might help in their investigation. Next to the pipe bridge, which was really just an irrigation pipe that people who traversed through Robin Hood Hills used as a bridge. There was also a bag found underneath this bridge that had clothing inside of it, mostly dark clothing that was found to be moldy, which, let's be honest, if it had been used in the murders when it was found, it should not have had mold on it. So I personally don't think it's probable that the clothing that was discovered was in fact tied to these crimes. A lot of transients came through West Memphis. There was and still is a very high number of drug addicts who call West Memphis home, and they traps to these places in order to get their fix and do whatever else it is that they are planning on doing. The swamp in this area would be drained to, again, look for evidence. Lo and behold, unfortunately for people who support the West Memphis 3, there were no snapping turtles found in the water. Honestly, the area where the bodies was found, the snapping turtles, I don't care how quick they are, to do the damage that was done to these boys, the amount of turtles that would have been needed, there would have been evidence of them having been in the water, if not evidence that they were actually there still. They found no evidence of this, which leads me to the conclusion that the idea that snapping turtles attacked the bodies while they were in the water, but nobody else, not the people who placed the bodies in the water. I think that's just absolute bunk and a half-hearted effort to try and explain away the evidence. Michael Moore was found to have several deep lacerations in the top of his skull, and it was noted that he had more trauma around the head than the other two boys, which is in line with the story that Jesse Miskelly told, that he basically took care of Michael Moore on his own, while Jason and Damien focused their attentions on Stevie and Christopher. In addition to the severe amount of head wounds, Michael's body was also found to have wounds to the chest, neck, and abdomen. It was later determined that these wounds were inflicted by some type of fixed serrated blade. It was also noted that Michael Moore had been alive when he had been placed into the water and had in fact drowned. Stevie Branch's body was covered with wounds to the genitals as well as the anal area, chest, head, arms, back, legs. Gouges were found in his body that were determined to have been caused when he was stabbed and had been moving at the time the stab wounds were inflicted. There was significant mutilation to his genital area, which is in line with what Jesse Miskelly told the police, that he had seen Jason Baldwin performing oral sex on one of the boys. His wrists and ankles both had severe abrasions where the boy had struggled against his bindings. Was also noted from injuries to his head that he had apparently been stomped down into the mud. As with Michael, Stevie too drowned. Christopher Byers was found to have injuries to his ears. Now, a lot of commentators have stated that the injuries to these ears are indicative that he had been forced to perform oral sex on an individual. I've covered a lot of cases involving child sexual abuse and child sexual abuse that leads to murder. I don't recall any case that I have covered or that I've come across where injuries were noted to have taken place on the child's ears. I don't see that one. It makes for a good story to make it more horrific. I haven't encountered any, and I've covered a lot of cases involving this type of thing. I'm just not seeing that, he was grabbed by the ears and, forced to perform a sex act on an individual. However, Chris did have extensive injuries to his head, abrasions, scratches. His legs had cuts on them, and it was later determined that he had severe traumatic injury to his head, most likely after having been struck by some large object like a stick or a baseball bat. The skin around his genitals had been removed, specifically on his penis, the sac for his testicles. It is also noted that there were injuries around the anal cavity, indicating that he more likely had not been cut with a knife of some type. The other major difference between Christopher and the other boys is that it was discovered that he had what appeared to be defensive wounds, which led investigators to believe that Christopher Byers, more likely than not, had fought back against his attackers more than the others had. It was also discovered that Christopher Byers, unlike his two friends, had bled out in the middle of the woods prior to being placed in the water. Not surprising when you consider the amount of injuries that he had, as well as the severity. It's very unlikely that even if these boys had not been placed inside of the water, and none of them would have survived. Their injuries were just too grave. I have read some articles stating that in the savagery of this attack, even if someone had stumbled upon the perpetrators in the commission of the crime, with the injuries that these boys had done to them, it is a very slim chance that any one of them would have been able to be saved had they been brought to a hospital. How true that is, I cannot state with 100% certainty. However, having seen the crime scene photographs and read the autopsy reports that are available, I am under the impression that this was a very savage attack whose sole purpose was to take the lives of these boys. Now, according to Gary Meese's book, Blood on Black, as soon as the bodies were discovered and it was learned by the gathering crowd just how horrific the assault was, people in the crowd began whispering amongst themselves that there may have been some form of satanic cult involvement. Again, that's something that I cannot verify. What I can verify, however, is that two individuals who were on the scene, Jerry Driver, who's Damian Eccles' parole officer, and Steve Jones, who was an assistant juvenile probation officer, is the guy that had seen the shoe floating in the canal. We do need to talk about something that I believe I mentioned in the first episode, and that's this idea that a satanic panic overtook the town of West Memphis. That is not what happened. satanic panic generally is media generated, and it was quite a while before the media started even publicly discussing the idea that there may have been occult involvement in these crimes. That being said, there are numerous cases prior to the murder of these boys where occult involvement was suspected. There were animals found in the woods that had been mutilated in the areas in and around Lakeshore. And as this case progresses, yes, you are going to see a lot of talk about the occult and of Damien Echols. I've never been able to verify this, nor have I ever seen anyone else able to verify this, that there was a cult of some type. Many state it was a satanic cult operating out of the Lakeshore trailer park. However, the residents that lived there certainly believed it enough to speak about it amongst themselves prior to these murders. And not only did they speak about it with themselves, it was really an open secret that there was some form of cult operating out of the trailer park, at least among the teenagers and other various youth. Many who lived in the trailer parks claimed affinity to Wiccan or black magic or Satanism or some other occult activity, and they admitted this freely. And I know you might think, no, that's just speculation. No, it's not. They're on public record having stated this. These trailer parks were home to a good number of carnival workers. Carnival workers, historically, I don't know if it's still the case, were involved and interested in things like that, and oftentimes the areas that they called home, they would pass these beliefs on to those around them, which is how it is believed that the youth inside of the trailer parks got involved and got interested in the occult. Again, this is all in police records. It's not hyperbole or speculation or anything like that. It's, it's in the public discourse. It's on record as a matter of fact. Many of those who were questioned stated that this cult that was operating out of there was run by an individual who has never been identified as being known as either Lucy or Lucifer. Was always said to be an older man of whom Damien Echols was a disciple. So now, we've got Steve Jones and Jerry Driver at the crime scene on the 6th. They're seeing all of this stuff, and the two of them start thinking to themselves, there's a possibility there might be some occult involvement in this. But there's more to it than that, at least for Driver. He's thinking back to the one individual he has on probation who is an admitted occultist who also has a propensity for extreme violence. This is Damien Echols. So the next day, June 7th, Driver and Jones both go to the Echols family home where they gain permission to speak with Damien Echols from his parents, which is kind of funny. Damien's 18, they don't need his parents' permission. And they go in there. Unfortunately, they did not record this conversation. However, they did note that there were a pair of boots and tennis shoes in the bedroom belonging to Damien Echols that were caked in mud. Now, both sides have kind of bitched about the fact that Driver and Jones did not take these articles of footwear into evidence and have a warrant taken into evidence. They weren't police officers. They were probation officers. They can't go into people's house and collect evidence in a homicide investigation. That's not their job. Me personally, I'm kind of surprised that nobody raised a stink over the fact that these two probation officers went to Eccles' home to question him about these murders. Concurrent with this going on, police received a tip that the pastor at the Lakeshore Baptist Church was concerned of devil worshippers in Lakeshore. This same pastor would go on to inform the police that he had heard that an individual by Damien Eccles and his girlfriend, Dominique Tier, were possibly involved in a cult, and that Eccles wore boots with 666 on them. On May 9th, a resident in Lakeshore named Narlene Hollingsworth, remember that name, you're going to hear it a lot, contacted the police and stated that she believed she had seen Damien Eccles, and whom she believed at the time to be Dominique Tier, in the vicinity of Robin Hood Hills on the night of May 5th. You remember I talked about this in earlier episodes. There were witnesses who placed Damien Eccles in the general vicinity of the crime scene on that night. Narlene, who was very familiar with Eccles, also again, she mistakenly said she saw Dominique Tier, unless Dominique Tier was somehow involved with this. But again, from a distance, Jason Baldwin with his long blonde hair was very effeminate looking. You couldn't fault somebody at 9 o'clock at night or whenever it was for mistaking a 16-year-old boy with long blonde hair for being a girl. Miss Hollingsworth also stated that the individual she saw appeared to be covered in mud, and also that on the night of the murders, a relative of hers who was roughly the same age as Damien and his crew, L.G. Hollingsworth, had been acting suspicious. On May 9th, officers spoke with Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Dominique Tier in the front yard of the Baldwin home, and it was during this interview that the police, using a pamphlet from the FBI, asked Eccles how he thought the killer would feel having committed these crimes, and Eccles is reported to have said that he thought the killer would have felt happy. He gave other responses about these crimes. We're going to get into it more, though, when we talk about Eccles being brought in for questioning. This is also the infamous interview where, as Baldwin is being questioned by the police, his mother comes home and refuses to let him speak any further with them. Now, there's those who are going to insist that Eccles was just answering these questions in a kind of flippant, too cool for the school type manner. However, as you're going to see when they question him further, the answers that Eccles gave really paint him and his friends in a bad light, and it is obvious from this, as well as from what is to come, that if you believe Eccles was being flippant about the whole thing just because, he was a snot-nosed punk, he can't bitch and moan about having been targeted given the answers that he did give. But there's also the fact that numerous people started contacting the police, and the name of Damien Eccles and of Jesse Miss Kelly kept coming up over and over and over again. For those who want to say that, the police railroaded these boys with, the help of the prosecutor's office, show me evidence of this. Show me evidence of this conspiracy. Just as, show me evidence that everybody who placed Eccles and Baldwin and Miss Kelly with this crime, who contacted the police stating that they believed they were involved, or that Eccles and the others had told them that they were involved in these murders. Show me the evidence where all of these individuals recanted their sworn testimony. Yes, some of them did, mostly because they got jumped on by the sycophantic supporters of these murderers. So that does not mean that what they said in court is any less valid, only that they were tampered with after the fact. Now, the police questioned Eccles a couple of times at this point, and while he was starting to look more and more like a viable suspect in the eyes of the law, they had not ruled out any other possibilities. That being said, on the 10th of May, the police again questioned Eccles. This was actually at the police station with Detective Ridge doing the questioning along with another individual. A lot of the supporters of the West Memphis Three make a big deal of the fact that Eccles was not given a lawyer at this point in time, but the reality is he didn't have to be given a lawyer. If he had wanted a lawyer at any point during this interview, he very simply could have said, "Hey, I want a lawyer, I'm not talking to anyone." And there's people, "Oh, he was only 18, he wouldn't have known that thing." In 1993, I was 12 years old. Guess what? I knew if you were to be spoken to by the police, if you said you want a lawyer, they have to stop talking to you. Just the simple facts of the matter. Now, during this interview, Eccles made a number of incriminating statements, saying that he believed the boys had been pretty ritualistically butchered, and that one of the boys, more likely than not, had been savaged worse than the other. This set off a red flag in Detective Ridge's head, because one of the boys had in fact been savaged worse than the others, and this was not public knowledge. This is what the police like to call holdback information. Information about the case that is very sensitive, and that they hold back in the hopes that should they come across a viable suspect, they may slip up and give the police that key piece of information that is only known to the killer and to the police. Eccles tells the officers this, and when asked where he had learned this information, Eccles responds that he had read it in one of the local papers, which we've already discussed is not true. And in court, Eccles even admits that he did not read that particular piece of information in the paper. Another key point that came out of this interview is that Eccles was asked why he believed the boys' bodies were placed inside of the water, and his response was he thought the killers had placed the bodies in the water because the killers had urinated inside of the boys' mouths. Now, on May 16th, the police are going to get a lab report back stating that a substance similar to urine was found inside some of the boys' stomach. At this point in the investigation, however, the police were unaware of it, and they simply made note of it as being a very unusual response to the question. More red flags are that Eccles was unable to give the police a definitive answer as to where he had been on the evening of May 5th. His story changed. The first story he told on the 9th was that he, Damini, and Jason had gone to Jason's uncle's house so Jason could mow the lawn, during which Damien called his father, who came and picked them up at roughly 6 p.m. and brought them home. Now, on the 10th, Eccles said that he and Damini had left Jason at his uncle's house and proceeded to the laundromat, where Damien said he called his mother, who came and picked the two of them up. Damien said his mother dropped Damien off at her house, and that Damien, his father, and his sister had then gone over to a family friend. This is the Sanders family, and they were apparently there from 3 until 6 p.m. After which, upon returning home, he was on the phone with a girl who would later inform the police that she had not, in fact, spoken to Damien on the night in question. It's important to note that Damien admitted under oath that he had, in fact, changed his story while talking with the police to make the time frames fit whatever particular narrative that he was trying to build, i.e., he was taking things that happened either at a different point in time or never happened and putting them into place in order that he could account for the time when it was believed that the boys were murdered. So he was lying. Those aren't my words. Those are Damien Echols' words. Police questioned him about his cult beliefs, and Damien explained them, further expounding on that he felt that the individual who had been responsible for the murders had some form of occult belief themselves, and that these killings were in fact a sacrifice. Now, Damien did have a polygraph test that day, and before the West Memphis 3 supporters jumped down my throat on this, yeah, he failed it, but that doesn't prove Damien did it. Polygraphs are bullshit. There's a reason they're not admissible in court, and it's because they are highly fallible and highly suspect. Being under stress can cause individuals to give a false positive or false negative when answering questions. So I'm not going to fault Damien Echols for having failed the polygraph test. We'll note, however, that of the 10 questions he was asked, the 5 that he failed were: at any time Wednesday or Wednesday night were you in Robin Hood Hills? Were you present when those boys were killed? Did you kill any of those 3 boys? Do you know who killed those 3 boys? Do you suspect anyone of having killed those 3 boys? Okay, so yeah, he failed the thing. That doesn't prove he did it. It's the other evidence that proved that Damien and his cohorts committed this horrific crime. When presented with the results of his polygraph examination, Echols continued to deny that he had been involved in any way, shape, or form with the killings before he eventually simply just stopped denying and did not respond to the questions being put to him. So it's more likely than not Damien realized at this point that the police were considering him a suspect, which is exactly what came from this interview. The police left this interview with the belief that Damien Echols was very probably a viable suspect. And no, it was not because of his occult beliefs or the fact that he wore a black trench coat and black clothes and walked around town. It was because Damien had a history, as already proven in our previous episodes, of violent acts towards others. He had numerous commitments to psych wards, and as the weeks progress, you're going to see more and more people start pointing the finger at Damien Echols as somebody they suspect as either having been involved in the murders or quite possibly as someone who was capable of committing those crimes. One other last piece that came from this interview is that Damien told the officers that he would tell them all about the crimes if he was allowed to talk to his mother. However, once he was allowed to speak with Pam, Damien again denied it and let the officers know that even if he had been involved, he would never let them know the details that he knew. Despite all of this, the police had no evidence to hold Damien Echols on May 10th, and they let him go. There had been a luminol test done at the crime scene, and it did show that blood was present around the base of a tree and in other areas. However, it was not admissible in court I've read different reasons for this, some stating that it was a botched luminol test, others that the test was contaminated by some outside agent. Regardless, the testing was not allowed in court. Had it been, it may have proven even worse for the West Memphis 3, as by the 10th, things are really starting to happen in this case. People are coming forward to talk to the police and to tell them the things that they not only suspect, but the things that they have been told and that they know. We're really going to get into testimony and statements that were given to police after the 10th in the next episode. We're going to switch track here and just discuss some of the evidence that was collected at the crime scene and what detectives were able to glean from this evidence. First and foremost, the crime scene was an absolute shambles, as by the time the bodies had been discovered, untold amount of people had been through the area. So any evidence that may have been gathered from the area would most likely have been contaminated, but that's not to say that evidence was not able to be collected from the bodies. Now, some of this evidence wasn't fully explained until years after the fact, and in this I'm talking specifically about hairs that were found in the bindings on the boys. Other evidence, however, was readily available to the investigators. One thing we have to dispel immediately is the idea that all cases are solved by using forensic evidence. I discussed this in other episodes, but it bears repeating at this point. Forensic evidence is not always available in cases, and even in cases where it is available. Despite the current narrative in law enforcement and the true crime community and television and Hollywood, DNA evidence is fallible. People are being increasingly found guilty on evidence that is later found to have been incorrect, this being DNA evidence. There's actually an entire podcast series about this, and you'll have to forgive me for not recalling the name of that podcast at this point. The app I used to use to listen to podcasts is no longer in existence, so I'm unable to remember the name of it, but there are podcasts out there that discuss this very phenomenon of DNA evidence being wrong. There was DNA evidence found in the West Memphis 3 case. You'll have to remember, too, that this DNA evidence was, in fact, pulled from the muddy water where the bodies were found. There was a mark on Stevie Byers' face, which the prosecution's witnesses said could have been made by a belt buckle or possibly the end of a Rambo-style hunting knife. Yeah, I'm aware of the whole idea that there were people, when they were trying to shift the blame away from the killers, they said that, it resembled John Mark Byers' bite mark. Okay, bite mark evidence has been largely disproven at this point, so that entire idea needs to be thrown out the window. Something struck this boy in the face. The experts thought that it was either a belt buckle or the handle of a knife. There were also hairs found in some of the knots used to tie these boys. One was a hair belonging to a black man. The other was a hair consistent with both Terry Hobbs and Jason Baldwin. If you go with the Baldwin side of things, that means Jason Baldwin is at the scene. If you go with the other side, the hair belonged to Terry Hobbs. That is very easy to explain away, as one of the murder victims lived with him. But not only that, the boys were known to the Hobbs family. They interacted quite often. It's very possible one of the other victims picked this hair up, and that during the course of their murder, the hair somehow got tied in with the knots. I personally think, given the fact that they're 8-year-old boys, the hair could very well have already been entwined with the shoelace. This kind of thing happens. Regardless, the hair does not exonerate Jason Baldwin. There was also DNA evidence found on one pair of jeans. However, this DNA has never been able to be linked to anyone. It should be noted that the lab that did the DNA testing at the time said that the DNA most likely came from sperm cells. If you'll recall Miss Kelly's confessions, he did state that Damien and Jason both masturbated over the boys, which would explain the presence of sperm cells. They also found green fibers on a pair of blue jeans, along with on Michael's Cub Scout hat, and these were linked and found to be microscopically similar to fibers found in a shirt in the Eccles home. There was also 3 cotton fibers that were red that were also similar to those found in the Eccles home. This was recovered from Michael's Cub Scout shirt, a pair of blue jeans, as well as a bag of items that was found at the crime scene. If you'll remember the last episode, I talked about the bag that was found underneath the pipe bridge, which, when it was discovered, was filled with mold. And this bag, really, the only thing other than this red fiber that could tangentially link it in any way to the crime is the fact that the bag came from Runner Petrol, where Damien Eccles' father was employed, which was also next to Albertson Roofing, where Eccles stated he had worked as a roofer. There was also a red fiber that was found to match Jason Baldwin's mother's bathrobe. There was also residue of a blue wax, which was similar to candle wax found in Dominique Tier's bedroom, along with wax found on a book of witchcraft in Damien's room. Similar wax was also discovered on a bar of soap in the Baldwin bathroom. The biggest piece of evidence actually found at the crime scene is the knots that were used to bind the boys. Michael was tied with 8 knots, Stevie with 10, and Christopher with 4. This suggests the presence of multiple assailants in the area, with each one of the assailants tying up. And that is just the baseline evidence that was discovered in and around the crime scene, and where some of this evidence was linked to. I'm going to call the episode here. Next week, we're going to dive into testimony that came into the police over the coming weeks and months. I hope you have enjoyed this installment of the West Memphis 3 Redux. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star review wherever it is you get your favorite podcasts. Consider becoming a Patreon over at tinyurl.com Deathcast Patreon. And last but not least, please consider donating to the show over at buymeacoffee.com/the+Deathcast. Till next time, the Deathcast is a production of Corpse Creek Publishing in association with Big Pond Podcasts. Stay morbid.